During a family gathering, my in-laws said I couldn't sit with the rest of the family. They had no idea what was coming. The Winters estate stood like a crown jewel atop the highest hill in Northbrook, its windows blazing with light against the darkening April sky. I sat in my car, staring at the sprawling mansion, each breath becoming more shallow as I mentally prepared for what awaited me inside. 3 years of marriage to William, and still, these gatherings felt like walking into a lion's den wearing meat-scented perfume. "You look beautiful," William said, squeezing my hand reassuringly. His smile was genuine, but the worry lines around his eyes betrayed his own anxiety. "Remember, we're only staying until dessert. Then we'll make our excuse and leave." I nodded, grateful for his support, though we both knew he'd say the same thing every time, and every time we'd end up staying until his mother deemed it acceptable for us to depart. Such was the power Eleanor Winters held over her son, over all her children. "Let's just get this over with," I said, forcing a smile. The gravel crunched beneath our shoes as we approached the grand entrance. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue dress, modest yet elegant, with minimal jewelry. Not too flashy to invoke criticism, not too plain to be called slovenly. Walking the tightrope of Eleanor Winters' approval was an art I had yet to master. William rang the doorbell, and moments later, Henderson, the family's longtime butler, greeted us with a polite nod. "Mr. William, Mrs. Winters," he said, taking our coats. I noticed how he addressed me by my married name rather than my first name, unlike how he greeted the rest of the family. Another subtle reminder that I remained an outsider. "William, darling." Eleanor's voice carried from the grand living room before we even stepped through the foyer. She glided toward us, a vision in expensive silk, her silver-streaked black hair swept into an immaculate updo. "You're finally here. Everyone's been waiting." She air-kissed both of William's cheeks before turning to me, her smile cooling several degrees. "Claire," she said, giving me a once-over that felt like a health inspection. "That's an interesting choice of dress." "Thank you, Eleanor," I replied, swallowing the bitter taste of her subtle criticism. We followed her into the main living area where at least 30 people mingled, the air thick with expensive perfume and pretension. William's siblings spotted us immediately. Charlotte, his older sister, waved excitedly while nursing a glass of champagne. James, the younger brother, gave a casual nod from his position near the fireplace, surrounded by what appeared to be business associates. "There's my boy." William's father, Richard Winters, boomed from across the room. Unlike his wife, Richard had always been cordial to me, if somewhat distant. He clapped William on the shoulder and gave me a brief, awkward hug. "Claire, you look well. Keeping this rascal in line, I hope." Before I could answer, Henderson announced that dinner was served, and the crowd began migrating toward the massive dining room. William took my hand, leading me through the throng of relatives and friends of the family. The Winters dining room was a showcase of old money and refined taste. The long mahogany table could seat 24 people comfortably, with a crystal chandelier hanging overhead that probably cost more than my parents' house. Silver candelabras and fresh flower arrangements lined the center of the table, and fine china gleamed at each setting. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, directing guests to their seats like a general positioning troops. "William, you're here next to Charlotte," she said, pointing to a spot near the center of the table. "And James, you're across from him." William looked around. "Where's Claire sitting?" Eleanor's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. "Oh, dear," she sighed, her voice dripping with false concern. "We're a little tight on space at the main table with all our special guests tonight." She gestured toward a smaller table set up in the corner of the room, clearly an afterthought. "Claire can sit over there with Cousin Mildred and her children." The room didn't exactly fall silent, but I felt several pairs of eyes turn in our direction. Cousin Mildred, a twice-divorced relative who apparently lived off family charity, sat alone at the small table with her 2 teenage children who were already absorbed in their phones. "Mother, that's ridiculous," William protested, his voice low but firm. "Claire's my wife. She sits with me." "It's just for dinner, William," Eleanor replied smoothly. We have the assistant and the Harringtons here tonight. The seating was arranged very specifically. She lowered her voice to a stage whisper. Besides, Claire wouldn't have much to contribute to the conversation. She'd be bored, really. Heat crawled up my neck and into my cheeks. 3 years of these subtle humiliations, these careful maneuvers to remind me of my place, or lack thereof, in the Winters family hierarchy. "It's fine," I said to William, squeezing his arm. "Really?" "No, it's not," he insisted, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. Standing up to his mother created a scene, and nothing was worse in Eleanor Winters' world than causing a scene. "Please," I whispered, "don't make this a bigger deal than it is." After a moment's hesitation, William relented, though the muscle in his jaw twitched with suppressed anger. With a final squeeze of my hand, he took his assigned seat, throwing apologetic glances my way as I made my way to the corner table. "Hello, Mildred," I said as cheerfully as I could manage, taking a seat across from the older woman. "Oh, hello, dear," she replied, clearly surprised to have company. "Banished to the children's table too, are we?" I forced a laugh. Something like that. As the servers began bringing out the first course, I watched the main table from my isolated position. Eleanor held court, introducing William to a gorgeous young woman seated beside him, the daughter of some important family, no doubt. Charlotte caught my eye and gave me a sympathetic look before returning to her conversation. I felt the heat rise in my face again, but this time with a different emotion. Not embarrassment, but determination. I bit my tongue and picked at my salad, observing the carefully orchestrated social chess match playing out before me. They had no idea what was coming. From my corner exile, I had an unobstructed view of the entire dining room. It was like watching a theater production where I knew all the characters but wasn't allowed on stage. The first course, some delicate arrangement of greens and imported cheese, was served with a flourish by Henderson and 2 other staff members. The main table received theirs first, naturally. By the time our table was served, Eleanor was already directing the conversation like a seasoned conductor. "Marilyn, you simply must tell everyone about your husband's new position on the hospital board," she prompted a thin woman with an ostentatious diamond necklace. Marilyn preened. "Oh, it's nothing really, though Thomas is the youngest board member in their history." "Fascinating," I muttered under my breath, stabbing at a cherry tomato. "They're awful, aren't they?" Mildred whispered, leaning toward me. Despite her status as the family charity case, there was a sharpness in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Been the same show for 40 years. Only the supporting actors change. Her teenage daughter rolled her eyes, without looking up from her phone. "Mom, please don't start." I smiled politely and turned my attention back to the main table, where the conversation had shifted to the topic that seemed to be on everyone's lips. "Have you secured your invitations to the Atherton Foundation Gala yet?" asked a ruddy-faced man whose name I couldn't recall. "I hear they're nearly impossible to come by this year." A ripple of excitement passed through the table. The Atherton Foundation Gala was the social event of the season, held annually to raise funds for medical research. In reality, it was less about charity and more about being seen with the right people. This year, the event had taken on almost mythical proportions due to its exclusive nature and rumored A-list attendees. "Richard and I received our invitations last week," Eleanor announced with practiced nonchalance that didn't quite mask her pride. "As foundation donors, we're guaranteed attendance." Charlotte leaned forward eagerly. "Is it true that they've completely redesigned the Blackwell Hotel ballroom for the event? I heard they're flying in orchids from Singapore. And that anonymous VIP guest everyone's talking about?" James chimed in. "Any ideas who it might be, Mother?" Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "No one knows for certain. The foundation is being unusually secretive this year. All we've been told is that a special guest has been granted authority over the final guest list and seating arrangements. Whoever they are, they've got the entire city buzzing," said the young woman seated next to William, Vanessa Harrington, as I'd learned from the introductions. "Daddy's been trying to find out through his connections, but even he's hit a wall." "Well, I'm sure it's someone of considerable influence," Eleanor replied smoothly. The Atherton Foundation wouldn't entrust such power to just anyone. I suppressed a smile as I sipped my water. If only they knew. 3 months ago, I'd been approached by Dr. Atherton himself after my research on affordable treatment options for rare immune disorders caught his attention. As a hospital pharmacist with a background in biochemistry, I devoted my spare time to this research, driven by memories of my own sister's battle with an immune disease that our family could barely afford to treat. Dr. Atherton had not only funded the continuation of my research, but had also appointed me to the Foundation's board. When the annual gala planning began, he'd unexpectedly asked me to oversee the final guest list to ensure that those who truly cared about the Foundation's mission were properly represented. "You bring a fresh perspective, Claire," he'd said. "You'll see people's true colors in ways our usual social circle might miss." The irony wasn't lost on me. While my in-laws dismissed me as socially irrelevant, I'd been silently building connections and respect in circles they desperately wanted to penetrate. The main course arrived, some elaborate beef dish for the main table, while our corner received the same but noticeably less artfully presented. William caught my eye from across the room and mouthed, "I'm sorry." I gave him a reassuring smile. He had no idea about my role with the Foundation. I'd wanted it to be a surprise when we attended the gala together. "Have you heard anything about this mysterious VIP, Claire?" Mildred asked, interrupting my thoughts. I nearly choked on my water. "What makes you think I would know?" She shrugged. "You don't seem as impressed by all this as everyone else. Either you're a saint or you know something they don't." I carefully placed my napkin on my lap. "Just not interested in the social climbing, I guess." Mildred studied me with newfound interest, but didn't press further. The conversation at the main table had shifted to business connections and stock portfolios, but inevitably circled back to the gala. It seemed to be the gravitational center of their social universe. "I've heard the Foundation is expanding their research grants this year," Richard commented. "Good PR move." "Who cares about the grants?" Charlotte laughed, waving her hand dismissively. "It's about who'll be there. Imagine the connections." I felt a familiar pang of disappointment. This was why I'd kept my position secret. To them, medical research was just a convenient backdrop for networking, not a mission to help people like my sister. "The guest list is what everyone's talking about," Eleanor said, her voice carrying deliberately across the room. "Apparently, this mystery person has been given carte blanche to add or remove names as they see fit." Can you imagine having that kind of power? The table murmured in agreement, each person likely imagining themselves in that position of influence. James raised his wine glass. "Well, whoever they are, I hope they recognize the value of having the Winters family well represented." "Here, here," several voices echoed. I took another bite of my dinner, watching as they toasted their own importance. From my vantage point in the corner, everything was crystal clear. The social maneuvering, the subtle competitions, the desperate need for validation. All of it laid bare like pieces on a chessboard. And for the first time since marrying into this family, I held the queen. Dessert arrived, a delicate panna cotta for the main table and simple ice cream for our corner outpost. The beautiful plating of the main table's dessert versus our plain scoops couldn't have been a more perfect visual metaphor for the evening's dynamics. I found myself less bothered by it now, almost amused by the theatrical display of hierarchy. Mildred's son, who had been silent all evening, finally looked up from his phone. "This is so lame," he muttered, just loud enough for his mother to hear. "Timothy Manners," Mildred hissed, though I detected a hint of agreement in her eyes. I offered the teenager a sympathetic smile. "It's almost over," I whispered, earning a surprised look from the boy before he returned to his screen. At the main table, William looked increasingly uncomfortable. Eleanor had strategically placed Vanessa Harrington next to him, and the young woman kept touching his arm while laughing at comments that weren't particularly funny. To his credit, William maintained polite distance, occasionally glancing my way with apologetic eyes. "So, William," Eleanor said loudly enough for me to hear, "Vanessa's father just acquired that pharmaceutical research company, Northwell Laboratories, wasn't it, dear?" Vanessa nodded, flashing perfect teeth. "Daddy says it's going to revolutionize drug development." They're working on some groundbreaking patents. My interest piqued despite myself. Northwell was a direct competitor to the lab where I conducted my research. How fascinating, William replied diplomatically. Though I believe some of their methods have been questioned by the research community. Claire would know more about that than I would. My heart warmed at his attempt to include me in the conversation, even from across the room. Eleanor's smile tightened. I'm sure Claire's work is very noble, she said dismissively. But Vanessa's father believes Northwell will set new industry standards. They've already secured several seats at the Atherton Gala, where they plan to announce their newest venture. I nearly choked on my ice cream. This was news to me and potentially concerning. If Northwell was planning to announce something at the gala, I needed to know what it was. Dr. Atherton was particularly strict about commercial interests not overtaking the charitable mission of the event. As if summoned by my thoughts, the doorbell rang. Henderson excused himself to answer it, returning moments later with an unexpected guest. Dr. Atherton to see you, Mrs. Winters, he announced. The dining room fell silent. Eleanor's eyes widened with surprise and unmistakable delight. Dr. Marcus Atherton, founder of the Atherton Foundation and one of the most influential people in the medical research community, stood in the doorway. At 72, he maintained the straight-backed posture of the military doctor he'd once been, his silver hair and beard immaculately trimmed. I apologize for the intrusion, he said, his British accent still strong despite decades in America. I was in the neighborhood for another engagement and thought I'd drop by to thank the Winters family personally for their continued support of the foundation. Eleanor practically leapt from her chair. Dr. Atherton, what an unexpected pleasure. Please join us. Henderson, set another place at the table immediately. That's very kind, but I can't stay long, Dr. Atherton replied. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on me in my corner, they lit up with recognition. Claire, I had no idea you would be here. The room went silent again, but with a different energy. All eyes swiveled between Dr. Atherton and me. I stood up, smoothing my navy dress. Hello, Dr. Atherton. These are my in-laws. Eleanor's face performed a fascinating transformation, confusion, then disbelief, followed by a desperate attempt to recalibrate her social calculations. You know each other? She managed, her voice an octave higher than usual. Dr. Atherton crossed the room to my corner table, completely bypassing the elaborate main table setting. Know each other? My dear woman, Claire is the reason I'm here tonight. He turned to me. I tried calling your cell, but when I couldn't reach you, I thought I'd try your home. Your housekeeper mentioned you were at your in-laws, and I remembered the address from our paperwork. William stood up, looking between us with equal confusion. Claire? What's going on? Dr. Atherton raised an eyebrow. You haven't told them? When I shook my head slightly, he chuckled. Always so modest. Well, I suppose the cat's out of the bag now. He turned to address the room. Claire has been instrumental in redirecting the Foundation's research focus toward more accessible treatment protocols. Her work is changing how we approach immune disorders. That's why I've asked her to join our board and to oversee certain aspects of our annual gala. The silence in the room was absolute. I could practically hear the mental recalculations happening in Eleanor's head. In fact, Dr. Atherton continued, I came to discuss some concerns about Northwell Laboratories' presence at the event. He glanced meaningfully at Vanessa, who seemed to shrink in her chair. But that can wait for a more appropriate time. Richard Winters, ever the businessman, recovered first. Dr. Atherton, we had no idea Claire was so involved with your organization. What a delightful surprise. Indeed, Eleanor echoed, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. Claire is so private about her work. William crossed the room to stand beside me, his face a mixture of pride and confusion. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. I wanted to surprise you, I replied softly. I didn't expect Dr. Atherton to show up here. Dr. Atherton checked his watch. I really must be going. Claire, perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss the seating arrangement concerns? There seem to be some expectations I should be aware of. Of course, I replied, enjoying how every mention of the seating arrangements made Eleanor flinch slightly. As Dr. Atherton prepared to leave, Eleanor rushed to escort him personally. Dr. Atherton, we're so honored by your visit. And rest assured, we're looking forward to the gala with great anticipation. As am I, he replied cordially. Claire has been quite selective about the final guest list. I trust her judgment implicitly. With those parting words hanging in the air, Dr. Atherton departed, leaving behind a room transformed. The power dynamics had shifted so dramatically I could almost hear the foundation of the house settling. William took my hand, a smile playing at the corner of his lips. You've been holding out on me, he whispered. I squeezed his hand, watching as Eleanor returned to the dining room, her face a complex mask of emotions. The night's not over yet, I replied. The dining room crackled with tension after Dr. Atherton's departure. Eleanor stood frozen by the doorway, her perfect hostess smile crumbling at the edges. For 3 long years, she had carefully constructed a narrative about me, the unworthy outsider, the girl from the wrong background who had somehow trapped her brilliant son. Now, that carefully maintained fiction was collapsing before her eyes. Well, Richard said, clearing his throat. This is certainly unexpected. William's arm slipped around my waist, a gesture of pride and solidarity. I knew Claire was working on something important, but she kept the details quiet. Eleanor finally moved back toward the table, her composure partially restored. How? Interesting that you didn't share such important information with your family, Claire. Her emphasis on family couldn't have been more pointed if she'd used italics. I wanted my work to speak for itself, I replied evenly. Besides, the foundation values discretion. Vanessa Harrington, suddenly aware that her position at the table next to William was no longer advantageous, shifted uncomfortably. I should probably call my father about this Northwell situation Dr. Atherton mentioned. What exactly is your role with the foundation, Claire? James asked, his tone somewhere between curious and calculating. Always the businessman, already plotting how to leverage this new connection. Before I could answer, Henderson reappeared at the doorway. Pardon the interruption, but Mr. Bradford has arrived. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. Sebastian Bradford? He wasn't expected tonight. He mentioned something about discussing the gala with Mrs. Claire Winters, Henderson replied, his usually impassive face betraying a hint of satisfaction. I suspected Henderson had witnessed enough of Eleanor's behavior over the years to enjoy this turn of events. Sebastian Bradford entered the dining room with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. As one of the city's most prominent philanthropists and the owner of the Blackwell Hotel, venue for the upcoming gala, his presence in any room was significant. Tall, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair and impeccable tailoring, he cut an impressive figure. I hope I'm not interrupting, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care if he was. His eyes scanned the room and landed on me. Claire, I'm so glad I found you. Marcel has been trying to reach you about the final menu approvals for the gala, and when I heard you were here, I thought I'd drop by. I was meeting with the Hendersons just down the street. The room had gone silent again. Eleanor looked as though she might faint. Sebastian, what a pleasant surprise, I said, stepping forward to shake his hand. Everyone, this is Sebastian Bradford. Sebastian, these are my in-laws, the Winters family. Sebastian nodded politely. Yes, we've crossed paths at various functions. Richard, Eleanor, good to see you again. His acknowledgement was cordial but brief, making it clear they were acquaintances rather than friends, another blow to Eleanor's carefully constructed social narrative. Mr. Bradford, Eleanor managed, what an unexpected pleasure. Would you care to join us for dessert? I'm afraid I can't stay, Sebastian replied. Just needed a quick word with Claire about the gala arrangements. He turned to me. Marcel is insistent about the menu adjustments you suggested, focusing on locally sourced ingredients rather than imports. The cost savings are substantial and, as you predicted, it's allowing us to upgrade the children's hospital donation package significantly. William watched this exchange with growing amazement. Claire's been working on all of this, he asked. Sebastian looked surprised. Your wife has been the driving force behind reorganizing the entire event, young man. When she showed Dr. Atherton how much of the budget was being wasted on appearances rather than directed to actual research, he gave her full authority to restructure everything. He chuckled. She's saved the foundation nearly $500,000 while actually improving the event. Quite remarkable. I felt a blush creeping up my neck. It was just common sense. The gala doesn't need imported orchids when local flowers are just as beautiful and support community businesses. Charlotte, who had been silently observing, suddenly laughed. Oh my God. You're the mystery VIP, aren't you, Claire? The one everyone's been talking about. All eyes turned to me. Sebastian's eyebrows rose. You haven't told him? Claire is more than just involved with the gala. She's personally reviewing and approving the final guest list, seating arrangements, everything. Dr. Atherton insisted. Said he wanted someone with a fresh perspective, someone who could see past the usual social. The silence in the room was deafening. Eleanor gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. That's why I came by, actually, Sebastian continued, oblivious to the tension. There's been some confusion about Northwell Laboratories requesting an entire table. I understand from Dr. Atherton that you have concerns about their inclusion. Vanessa Harrington abruptly stood up. I should really call my father, she muttered, excusing herself from the table. We can discuss it tomorrow, I said to Sebastian. It's a complicated situation that needs careful consideration. Sebastian nodded. Of course. I'll leave you to your family gathering. He smiled at the room. I'm looking forward to seeing some of you at the gala, though I understand space is quite limited this year. His eyes twinkled with amusement as he looked at me. Claire's been quite selective. With that parting shot, unintentional though it might have been, Sebastian took his leave. The dining room remained silent after his departure. Eleanor slowly sank into her chair, her social calculations completely upended. Richard looked thoughtful, likely recalibrating his assessment of his daughter-in-law. Charlotte and James exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their shock. From her corner table, Mildred raised her water glass in a small toast to me, a mischievous smile playing at her lips. William took my hand, squeezing it gently. You're full of surprises tonight, he whispered. I returned the squeeze, watching as the reality of my position slowly dawned on everyone present. The girl they had relegated to the corner table now held the power to include or exclude them from the social event of the season, an event they had been desperately trying to leverage for their own advancement. The tables had turned so completely, it was almost poetic. The remainder of dessert passed in strained conversation. Eleanor made several attempts to regain control of her carefully orchestrated evening, but the power dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Every few minutes, someone would glance at me with new eyes, reassessing, recalculating. I think, William said, rising from his seat, that Claire and I should join each other for dessert at least. Without waiting for his mother's approval, he picked up his dessert plate and walked over to the corner table, pulling up a chair beside me. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, but no protest emerged. For perhaps the first time in her life, she seemed genuinely at a loss. That's better, William said, taking my hand under the table. Though I still can't believe you kept all this from me. I wanted to surprise you, I admitted. Just not quite like this. Mildred chuckled. Best dinner theater I've seen in years. Across the room, I noticed James whispering something to Charlotte, both of them occasionally glancing my way. Richard had pulled out his phone and appeared to be checking something, likely researching the Atherton Foundation and my possible connections there. It didn't take long for the first direct approach. James casually stood, straightened his expensive suit jacket, and made his way to our table. Mind if I join you? He asked with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. James had always been the most calculating of William's siblings, forever looking for angles and advantages. Please, I gestured to an empty chair, curious to see his approach. He settled in, immediately leaning forward with conspiratorial friendliness. Claire, I had no idea you were so connected in the medical research world. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you, James. You know, he continued, his voice taking on that smooth quality he used for business negotiations, Winters Investments has been considering expanding our portfolio in the biotech sector. Perhaps we could discuss some potential synergies with the Foundation's work? I'd love to get your insights on promising research areas. William gave his brother a flat look. Really, James? That's your play? James had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but pressed on. I'm just saying there could be mutual benefits. The Foundation needs funding, and we're looking for worthy investments. The Foundation has sufficient funding, I replied evenly. Dr. Atherton is particularly careful about avoiding conflicts of interest. James nodded, undeterred. Of course. But speaking of the gala, I assume the family will be seated together? Mother's been talking about it for months. And there it was, the real reason for his approach. Before I could respond, Charlotte appeared at our table, not even bothering with a pretext. Claire, darling, she said, her voice honey-sweet, I've been thinking about how I could help with the gala. I have experience planning charity events, you know. I'd be happy to offer any assistance you might need. William snorted into his dessert. Charlotte threw him an irritated glance before turning back to me with a renewed smile. I took a sip of water, considering my response. That's very kind, Charlotte. The planning is mostly complete at this point, but I'll certainly keep your offer in mind. She hesitated, then plunged ahead. And about the seating arrangements, I do hope you'll consider putting me near the Harringtons. Vanessa and I were just discussing some charitable work we might collaborate on. Were you? I asked mildly, glancing at Vanessa, who had returned to the table and was now watching our conversation with poorly disguised interest. How nice. From across the room, Eleanor finally seemed to recover her composure. She stood with regal dignity and approached our increasingly crowded corner table. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Claire, she said, her voice carefully modulated, I believe we should have a private word. I met her gaze steadily. Anything you'd like to say to me can be said here, Eleanor. Her smile tightened. Very well. I feel there's been a misunderstanding earlier about the seating arrangements for dinner. Henderson must have made an error. I raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. Eleanor continued, her voice strained but determinately pleasant. Families should, of course, sit together. Always. I would never intentionally separate you from William. How interesting, I replied. It seemed quite intentional when you said I wouldn't have much to contribute to the conversation. Several people at the table exchanged uncomfortable glances. Eleanor's perfect mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of anger before she regained control. A poor choice of words on my part, she conceded with visible effort. I was merely concerned that the business discussions might bore you. Like the discussion about the Atherton Foundation gala that dominated dinner? I asked innocently. Richard approached, joining the increasingly awkward gathering. Claire, I've just been reading about your research. Quite impressive work on making treatments more accessible. Very commendable. Thank you, Richard. I've always believed that healthcare should be more accessible, Eleanor added quickly. In fact, that's why we donate to the Atherton Foundation in the first place. I nodded, remembering the years of dismissive comments about my modest career in pharmaceutical research, the thinly veiled suggestions that I should focus on supporting William's career rather than pursuing my own. It's wonderful to hear you say that, Eleanor, I said. Especially since you once told Aunt Margaret that my work was a charming hobby that I would surely outgrow once I understood my responsibilities as a Winters wife. Eleanor flushed. William stiffened beside me, clearly hearing this for the first time. Mother, did you really say that? He asked quietly. It was a misunderstanding, Eleanor insisted, her composure cracking further. Claire, surely you know how much we value you as part of the family. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, the same people who had been perfectly content to see me isolated just hours before, now scrambling to rewrite history and secure their positions. That's the thing about family, Eleanor, I said calmly. Real family doesn't need a reason to treat you with respect. They don't suddenly discover your worth when you become useful to them. A heavy silence fell over the table. In that moment, I felt neither triumph nor vindication, just clarity. The power shift wasn't about getting revenge. It was about finally being seen for who I truly was. William's hand found mine again, squeezing gently in silent support and perhaps apology for not seeing his family's treatment of me more clearly before tonight. Eleanor's perfect hostess smile returned, brittle but determined. Of course. And we have always respected you, Claire. Perhaps we haven't shown it as clearly as we should have. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from Eleanor Winters. I appreciate that, I said simply, neither accepting nor rejecting her olive branch. Now, shall we finish dessert? I believe Henderson mentioned coffee to follow. Coffee was served in the grand living room, where the evening had begun hours earlier. The atmosphere had transformed completely. Instead of being ignored at the periphery, I now found myself at the center of attention. Eleanor had strategically placed herself beside me on the sofa, attempting to create an illusion of intimacy and long-standing camaraderie. "Claire, darling," she said, her voice honeyed with newfound affection, "I've been thinking about your wonderful work with the foundation. I'd love to host a small luncheon for you to meet some of my friends who are passionate about medical research. The Carmichaels, the Winthrops, people with real influence." "That's very thoughtful," I replied, sipping my coffee. "I'll have to check my schedule. The next few weeks are quite busy with gala preparations." William, seated on my other side, gave me a subtle wink. He was enjoying this reverse dynamic, perhaps even more than I was. Across from us, Richard cleared his throat. "Claire, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. Winters Enterprises has a charitable foundation that's been somewhat dormant lately. Perhaps you might have some insights on how we could revitalize it? Maybe create some partnership opportunities with the Atherton Foundation?" "An interesting proposition," I acknowledged, though the Atherton Foundation is quite selective about its partnerships. Of course, Richard nodded earnestly. "Quality over quantity. We could start small, perhaps a joint table at the gala?" And there it was again, the thinly veiled attempt to secure those coveted seats. Charlotte chimed in from her armchair. "Speaking of the gala, Claire, I'd be happy to lend you some jewelry for the evening. I have a sapphire set that would complement your coloring beautifully." The same jewelry she had pointedly never offered to lend me for previous events, despite frequent mentions of how she shared pieces with her close friends. James, ever the practical one, went straight to the point. "About the gala invitations, Claire, I assume the family will be well represented? Mother and father have their donor invitations, of course, but for the rest of us." I placed my coffee cup delicately on its saucer, the soft clink drawing everyone's attention. The moment had come for what they all truly wanted to know. "The guest list for the gala was finalized yesterday morning," I said calmly. A tense silence fell over the room. Eleanor's smile froze in place. "Finalized?" Charlotte echoed, her voice rising slightly. "But surely there's still flexibility for immediate family?" I met her gaze steadily. Dr. Atherton and I reviewed each invitation personally. We were very selective this year, focusing on individuals who have demonstrated genuine commitment to the Foundation's mission rather than just financial contributions. "But we are contributors," Eleanor interjected, her composure slipping. "The Winters family has donated to the Atherton Foundation for years." "Yes," I acknowledged. "And those donations secured invitations for you and Richard, as I mentioned. The Foundation is grateful for your financial support. But what about the rest of us?" James pressed, abandoning any pretense of subtlety. "Surely you can make arrangements." William shifted uncomfortably beside me. He understood what was happening, the moment of reckoning that had been building all evening. I took a deep breath, feeling no triumph or vindictiveness, only a calm certainty that this was necessary, not as revenge, but as a lesson in respect and genuine connection. The Foundation decided this year to prioritize those who contribute more than just money, those who contribute time, expertise, and genuine passion for improving medical access for all patients, not just those who can afford it. I looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. Those who understand that the value of a person isn't determined by their social connections or family name, but by their character and actions. The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she set down her own coffee cup. "I see," she said quietly. I have, however, reserved 2 additional seats, I continued, for Mildred and her children. From her armchair in the corner, Mildred looked up in genuine surprise. Me? But why? Because your volunteer work at County Hospital's pediatric ward exemplifies exactly the kind of commitment the Foundation values. Dr. Atherton was quite impressed when I mentioned your 15 years of service. Mildred's eyes widened. You knew about that? William mentioned it once. Unlike some, I listen when people talk about things that matter. The pointed comment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Charlotte and James exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard studied his hands. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her social mask finally cracking completely. This is absurd, she said, her voice tight. To exclude family while inviting, she stopped herself, but the damage was done. While inviting someone you consider beneath you? I finished for her. Someone who doesn't belong at the main table? The parallel was unmistakable. Eleanor had the grace to flush. That's not what I meant, she murmured, but her protest lacked conviction. I stood, smoothing my dress. William and I should be going. It's getting late. William rose immediately, placing his hand supportively at the small of my back. Yes, we should. Thank you for dinner, Mother. Eleanor looked up, suddenly desperate. Claire, please reconsider. Families should support each other. Surely, there must be something we can do to fix this misunderstanding. I regarded her thoughtfully. You know, Eleanor, that's exactly right. Families should support each other, not just when it's convenient or advantageous, but always. Not just at the main table, but even at the small table in the corner. I took William's hand and turned to the rest of the family. The gala is in 3 weeks. Between now and then, I'll be volunteering at County Hospital every Saturday morning, working with children who can't afford proper medical care. Anyone who joins me there, who demonstrates through actions, not words, that they understand what the Foundation truly stands for, might find that the guest list isn't quite as finalized as I suggested. Their expressions ranged from shock to calculation to, in Mildred's case, genuine admiration. Good night, I said simply, and with William's hand firmly in mine, we walked out of the grand house, leaving them to consider what true family and true worth really meant. As we stepped into the cool night air, William pulled me close. That was both the most terrifying and most impressive thing I've ever seen, he whispered against my hair. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. I didn't do it for revenge, I said softly. I did it because some lessons can only be learned through experience. Do you think they'll show up at the hospital? I glanced back at the house, its windows still blazing with light. Some might not. But either way, they'll never look at me or themselves the same way again. And that, I realized, was the ultimate payback, not exclusion or humiliation, but the opportunity for genuine change. The choice was now theirs to make.